When you think about the fall of Rome, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Probably some huge, epic battle, right? Barbarians at the gates, fire everywhere. But what if I told you that's just one tiny piece of a way bigger, more complicated puzzle, that the end of the world's greatest empire was less of a sudden explosion and more of a long, slow-motion train wreck? I mean, really think about that for a second. How does an empire that stretched all the way from Britain down to Egypt, an empire that basically was the known world for centuries, just stop existing? It's one of the biggest questions in all of history. And you know what? The simple answer we all learned in school just doesn't cut it. Not even close. So in this explainer, we're going to tear this whole thing apart. First, we'll bust the big myth about how it all ended. Then, we're going to look at the deep cracks that were forming inside the empire's foundation for years. After that, we'll see how outside pressures basically lit the fuse. And finally, we'll get into the really fascinating part. What happened after Rome fell? Ready? All right, let's get into it. Okay, Section 1, the myth of the fall. The most important thing to get your head around here is that we are not talking about one bad day. This was a very, very long process. Everyone loves to point to that one date, 476 AD. That's when the last Roman emperor in the West was kicked off his throne. It's a convenient date, right? It lets you wrap up a messy story with a nice, neat little bow. But history is never that clean. The truth is, by 476, the Western Roman Empire was basically a hollowed-out shell of its former self. The real story, the real rot, had started centuries before. And this quote just nails it. This is the whole idea in a nutshell. Forget a single sword to the heart. Instead, I want you to picture a slow, grinding process of 1,000 little wounds, political stabs, economic bleeding, military exhaustion. No single one of them was enough to kill the empire on its own, but altogether, yeah, they were absolutely fatal. So what exactly were those cuts? Well, that brings us right to Section 2, where we dig into the cracks in the foundation. These were all the internal problems, the self-inflicted wounds that made Rome so incredibly vulnerable to begin with. This internal decay really boils down to three major interconnected crises. First, the politics were an absolute dumpster fire. Second, the economy was rotting from the inside out. And third, the military was stretched so thin it was about to snap. Now check out this slide. One number, 26. What is that? Well, get this. In just a 50-year period, during something called the crisis of the 3rd century, Rome had 26 different emperors. 26 leaders in 50 years. I mean, just try to imagine running a country when the guy in charge changes every 2 years, and usually because he got assassinated. It was pure chaos. The empire was constantly at war with itself, and with nobody stable at the top, it was totally impossible to fix any of the other huge problems that were piling up. And you know how they paid for all those armies and civil wars? Basically by cheating. The emperors started mixing cheaper metals, like copper, into their silver coins so they could make more money. This is called currency debasement. And the result? People totally lost faith in the money, its value just plummeted, and you got this insane inflation that absolutely crushed regular people. And of course, all that economic chaos made it even harder to pay for the one thing the empire desperately needed: its army. The borders were massive, threats were coming from everywhere, and the military was just bleeding money. So to fill the ranks, Rome started hiring more and more non-Roman soldiers, mercenaries, whose loyalty wasn't really to the idea of Rome, it was to whoever was signing their paycheck. You can see how that might become a problem. So you've got an empire that's politically shaky, economically a mess, and militarily fragile. Now, let's add the final ingredient to our perfect storm, the pressure from the outside. This is the part of the story with the barbarians, but it's probably not what you're picturing. You know, the term barbarian invasions is actually kind of misleading. It's better to think of this as a series of mass migrations. We're talking about huge groups of people, the Goths, the Vandals, you name it, who were on the move, a lot of the time because they were running from even scarier groups like the Huns. They didn't always show up wanting to burn Rome to the ground. A lot of them wanted to join it, looking for safety and land. But the weakened Roman system just couldn't handle that kind of pressure. It buckled. And that pressure led to a series of really devastating shocks. In 410, for the first time in 800 years, the city of Rome itself was sacked. The physical damage wasn't even the worst part. It was the psychological blow. I mean, if the eternal city of Rome itself could fall, was anything safe anymore? Then you have these desperate, bloody battles against guys like Attila the Hun.
And it all leads up to 476, when a German chieftain just walks in, deposes the last emperor, who was just a teenager, by the way, and didn't even bother to name a replacement. The Western Empire just winked out.
But was that really the end? No, not really. And that brings us to our final section, which is maybe the most surprising part of this whole story, the empire's afterlife. Because the fall wasn't so much an ending as it was a massive transformation. Okay, so here's the detail that everybody forgets. It was only the western half of the empire that fell. The West shattered into a bunch of smaller kingdoms, which is basically the start of the medieval world, or the Dark Ages. But the eastern half, with its super-rich capital at Constantinople, it didn't just survive, it thrived for another 1,000 years. We call it the Byzantine Empire, and it's where all that classical Roman and Greek knowledge was kept safe.
And even back in the West, Rome didn't just vanish into thin air. The idea of Rome, man, that turned out to be one of the most powerful forces in history. Its legal ideas are the basis for our laws. Its language, Latin, evolved into French, Spanish, and Italian. Its engineering and culture became the absolute bedrock of Western civilization. In a very, very real way, we are all still living in the world that Rome built.
So what's the big takeaway from all this? Rome's long, messy decline is this powerful, maybe even scary reminder that no empire, no system, no country is invincible. Nothing is permanent. It teaches us to look for those slow, creeping internal problems, the deep political divisions, the economic weaknesses, and that leaves us with one last question to think about. What are the cracks in the foundation that we ought to be watching for in our own world today?